Welcome to Swords and Hammers. Truth comes clothed in tales, and the soul remembers what the mind alone forgets. The world is loud, but for the next few minutes, it can wait. Take a moment, settle yourself, listen well. Come, let us begin. The Shepherd's Song. Prologue. The Two Hills. The pilgrim stood upon a barren plain where the wind spoke only of endings. Before him, the world was cloven in two by a deep ravine, and on either side of it rose a hill. The hill to his left was a place of skulls, a scarred and wretched mound of rock and dust. No living thing grew upon its slopes. It seemed to hold a memory of profound agony, and from its peak the wind carried the echo of a terrible ancient cry. My God, why have you forsaken me? The sound of it hollowed out the soul and made a ruin of all hope. It was a hill of endings, and its shadow was despair. The hill to his right was altogether different. It was green, rolling, and alive. From its gentle slopes rose the scent of thyme and wet earth, and the sound of water running over smooth stones. A quiet melody, a song of peace, seemed to emanate from the very grass itself. It was a hill of beginnings, and its light was life. Yet the pilgrim knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that there was no path to the green hill that did not first pass under the shadow of the scarred one. The comfort of that pasture was born of the cost of that cross. He was a foolish creature, prone to wander, weak and utterly defenseless. He knew how to get lost, but he had forgotten the way home. And so he stood between the ending and the beginning, starving and afraid, until a shadow fell over him. Not the shadow of the hill of skulls, but the shadow of a man. A shepherd stood beside him. He did not ask the pilgrim where he had been, only where he was going. And when the pilgrim could not answer, the shepherd smiled, and his voice was like the sound of the still waters. "Come," he said, "I will lead you." Chapter 1. The Word in the Pasture. The shepherd led him, and the path he took skirted the edge of the dreadful hill, and began the slow, sunlit ascent of the other. As they walked, the pilgrim felt the gnawing hunger in his soul begin to quiet. The shepherd's presence was itself, a kind of bread. He brought the pilgrim to a meadow so green it hurt the eyes. The grass was long and lush, a deep emerald carpet upon the earth. The pilgrim, weary beyond measure, fell to his knees, and saw that the blades of grass were not plain. Each one shimmered, and upon its surface was woven in threads of silver light a word of promise. He ate, and it was not grass he tasted, but truth. It was sweeter than honey. It was strength and substance, and it filled the empty places within him. He ate until he was full, and then the shepherd made him to lie down in that pasture of the Word. It was a rest so deep it felt like being remade. From there, the shepherd led him to a pool of water, so clear and still it seemed a piece of the sky had fallen to earth. The pilgrim knelt to drink, and as he did, he saw his reflection. The face that looked back was not his own, or rather, it was his own, but now cleansed of all the dust of his foolish wanderings, washed of all the stains of his fear. The water was cool on his tongue, and it was not mere water. It was peace. It was a quiet, cleansing grace that flowed into him and restored his soul. Lying in the pasture, having drunk from the waters of rest, the pilgrim looked at the one who had found him. A declaration rose unbidden from his heart, the first true word his soul had ever spoken. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact, a testimony born of having been fed. "The Lord is my shepherd," he whispered. "I shall not want." And for his own name's sake, the shepherd then led him onward, upon paths of righteousness that sometimes circled back on themselves, teaching the pilgrim the same lessons of dependence again and again, until they were learned not just in his mind, but in his feet. Chapter 2. The Valley of Unbeing. The path for a time was pleasant, but every path on this side of home must, sooner or later, descend into shadow. The way grew narrow, and the green slopes gave way to black, splintered rock that rose like daggers on either side. The sun was blotted out. A profound chill seeped from the stone, a cold that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with dread. They had entered the Zalmavet, the valley of the shadow of death. It was a place of unbeing, where light, warmth, and hope came to die. Every sound was swallowed by a hungry silence. The shepherd walked ahead, and the pilgrim followed, his heart a frantic drum in his chest. And then the whispers began. They came from nowhere and everywhere at once, slithering from the cracks in the rock. They were not loud, but they were sharp, and they knew his name. "Foolish sheep," the whispers hissed. "Look at you. You are a failure, a fraud. Do you think he does not see the filth in your heart?" The pilgrim tried to recite the truths he had learned in the pasture. "He is my shepherd," he stammered into the darkness. "He restores my soul." The whispers laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. Words, pretty words for the sunshine. They have no power here. He has led you here to abandon you. This is the end you deserve. Fear, cold and absolute, began to master him. The shepherd seemed a distant memory, a dream from another life. The whispers grew more insistent, weaving from his own past a tapestry of shame and regret. He stumbled, falling to his knees. The darkness was total. He was alone. His second-hand faith, his remembered doctrines, they were all just brittle sticks against a tide of despair. They shattered. In that moment of utter unmaking, with nothing left in him of his own strength, a cry was torn from the deepest part of his being. It was not a recitation. It was not a doctrine. It was a name. He no longer spoke about his shepherd. He cried out to him, "Jesus, you are with me!" The words blazed in the darkness, and the darkness recoiled. Chapter 3. The Comfort of the Rod. The shepherd stopped and turned. He had been there all along, a pace ahead, waiting for the pilgrim's cry. He stepped back, placing himself between the pilgrim and the unseen source of the whispers. In one of his hands, he held his long staff, the crook of it smooth and worn. It was the staff of guidance, the tool of rescue, and the sight of it was a comfort. But it was not the staff he raised against the darkness. In his other hand, he held the rod. It was a different thing entirely. It was shorter, heavier, a weapon made of gnarled, unbreakable wood. It was not a tool of gentle guidance. It was an instrument of war, a scepter of judgment. It hummed with a terrible authority, and the pilgrim saw that it was scarred, as if it had once struck something with world-shattering force. From the deepest shadows, a form began to coalesce, a being of malice and accusation, the author of the whispers. It recoiled as the shepherd raised the rod, not in fear of a blow, but in terror of what the rod represented. And the pilgrim understood. The comfort of the rod was not in its gentleness, but in its terrifying power. It was the shepherd's promise that any enemy who came for the sheep would first have to face the shepherd's wrath. The rod was a weapon mighty enough, to break the teeth of lions and the backs of wolves. The accuser hissed one last time, "He is a sinner. He belongs to me. Justice demands it." The shepherd did not answer with words. He simply held forth the rod. And in the faint light that it seemed to generate, the pilgrim saw the shepherd's hands and his feet. They were pierced. They bore the marks of a violence that dwarfed the threat of the valley. In a flash of awful, glorious understanding, the pilgrim saw it all. The shepherd had not just wielded the rod of justice. For the pilgrim's sake, he had stood and taken its full, crushing blow upon himself. He who was the shepherd had also been the lamb. The power of the rod was not mere threat. It was a judgment already executed. Its authority was sealed in the shepherd's own blood. At the sight of those wounds, the accuser gave a final, strangled cry and dissolved back into the nothingness from which it came. The whispers ceased. The profound silence of the valley returned, but it was no longer a hungry silence. It was a peaceful one. The shepherd lowered the rod and with his wounded hand helped the pilgrim to his feet. Chapter 4. The Table in the Light. The path began to climb again, and soon they emerged from the ravine, blinking in the sudden, brilliant light. They stood upon a high, sun-drenched mesa, and there, in the center of the plateau, was a table, prepared for a feast. The shepherd, who had been his guide and his guardian, now became his host. He led the pilgrim to the table and bade him sit. And as he sat, the pilgrim looked back over the edge of the mesa. Far below, in the gloom of the valley he had just escaped, he could see them, the shadows, the fears, the shape of the accuser. They were still there, watching, but they were powerless. They could not climb. They were forced to be spectators to his honor. The shepherd then took a flask of fragrant oil and poured it over the pilgrim's head. The oil ran down his face and beard, and it was not just a balm for his skin, but for his soul. It was an anointing of joy. Where it touched him, the memory of the valley's terror was not erased, but healed, redeemed, and turned into a reason for praise. Then the shepherd filled a cup with wine the color of deep rubies, and gave it to him. The pilgrim drank, and his heart was filled with a joy so abundant, so extravagant, that it felt as if it must surely burst. The shepherd smiled and filled the cup again, and again until it ran over, spilling onto the dry ground at the pilgrim's feet. And where the wine touched the earth, crimson flowers bloomed in an instant. The shepherd's grace was not merely enough, it was a glorious, life-giving excess. This was the feast of victory. The testimony of the pilgrim's life was not to be a grim tale of survival, but a joyful song of the shepherd's superabundant goodness. Epilogue. The Hounds of Heaven. When the feast was done, the shepherd pointed toward the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of gold. Far away, so distant it seemed more a feeling than a sight, was a light that was not the sun. It was a house, and it was home. "Your journey continues," the shepherd said, "but you will not walk alone." The pilgrim set his face toward the light and began to walk. The path was clear now. After a time, he heard a sound behind him, a panting, a padding of feet. He turned, a flicker of old fear returning, expecting to see some lingering horror from the valley. But he saw no monsters. Instead, two magnificent hounds were bounding after him. They were not beasts of prey, but creatures of light and muscle and joyful speed. One was named Goodness, the other Mercy. They had been sent by the shepherd. He understood then that he was being followed, pursued, hunted down not by his enemies, but by the relentless, covenant-keeping love of his God. All the days of his life, these two would be at his heels, nipping at him when he strayed, driving him back to the path, herding him with tireless energy toward the front door of his Father's house. The journey was not over, but the end was certain. He turned back toward the light and walked on, with the shepherd's song in his heart, and the hounds of heaven at his heels. Selah.